Before you assume this headline is about the one bunker buster strike that actually matters most in this entire war, I need to stop you, because it isn't. There have been real bunker buster strikes on Iran, several of them, and I'm going to walk you through exactly what they hit and what they didn't. But the single most important bunker buster story in this entire conflict is about a mountain that has not been struck yet, one that multiple nuclear experts say might not even be destroyable by the most powerful bomb America has ever built. At least, not with a single clean strike the way a triumphant headline might imply. Stick with me, because that part is genuinely one of the strangest, most technically fascinating threads running through this entire war right now. Former combat fighter pilot here, years flying the F-15E in actual combat operations. Time as a Thunderbird pilot after that, years after that flying commercial jets for a living, once my time in the fighter community had fully wrapped up for good. I'm not a munitions engineer, and I want to be upfront about that limitation right away, but I've spent a career around exactly this kind of weapons employment, and understanding what these specific bombs can and can't actually do physically is genuinely useful for cutting through a lot of the exaggerated language currently getting thrown around this topic right now. Let's start with what a bunker buster actually is at a basic technical level, because the term gets used pretty loosely in headlines, and it covers a much wider range of weapons than people realize. At the small end, you've got things like the GBU-31 with a BLU-109 warhead, a roughly 2,000-pound class weapon that's been in very active use throughout this entire conflict against hardened but relatively shallow targets. One step up is the newer GBU-72, a 5,000-pound class penetrator that the Air Force has used specifically to hit things like Iranian anti-ship missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz earlier this year, giving commanders a middle option between standard 2,000-pound weapons and the true heavyweight. There's also a slightly older weapon worth mentioning for context, the GBU-28, a 5,000-pound laser-guided bunker buster that's actually been in U.S. service since the early 1990s, originally rushed into development during the Gulf War, specifically to deal with deeply buried Iraqi command bunkers. The newer GBU-72 is essentially a modernized successor to that same basic concept, satellite-guided instead of purely laser-guided, giving it better accuracy in poor visibility conditions. Understanding that lineage matters because it shows this entire category of weapon wasn't invented for this specific war. It's the product of decades of accumulated American experience, specifically targeting hardened and buried facilities across multiple conflicts, refined and improved each successive time. A new generation of harder, more deeply buried targets showed up somewhere in the world and forced military planners back to the drawing board. And then at the very top, there's the GBU-57, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound class bomb over 20 feet long that is genuinely the largest, heaviest conventional bunker buster the U.S. military has ever fielded in its entire operational history. Only the B-2 stealth bomber can actually carry and deploy it, and each B-2 can only carry 2 at a time. That GBU-57 is the weapon most people picture when they hear bunker buster, and it's already got real history in this exact conflict. Back in June of last year, 7 B-2 bombers dropped 14 of these MOPs on Iran's Fordo and Natanz nuclear facilities in the operation that came to be known as Midnight Hammer, the strike that first put the specific weapon into actual combat use rather than just testing. Let me give you a few more specifics on this weapon, because the engineering behind it is genuinely wild once you understand what it's actually built to do. The MOPI is over 20 feet long, about 2.5 feet in diameter, filled with roughly 4,500 pounds of specialized explosive fill. And it's a precision-guided weapon, not a dumb bomb, meaning it's steered toward a specific aim point rather than just falling ballistically. Its entire purpose is kinetic penetration, using its sheer mass and the velocity built up during its fall to physically punch through earth, rock, and reinforced concrete before the explosive charge even detonates, at which point it's already deep underground, where the blast does the most damage to whatever structure it was aimed at. That's fundamentally different from how a standard bomb works, where the explosion itself does most of the destructive work right at or near the surface. Only 19 B-2 stealth bombers have ever been built and remain in operational service today, and each one can carry at most 2 of these MOPs at a time, which tells you just how scarce and deliberately allocated this specific capability actually is within the broader Air Force fleet. Since then, it's shown up again in this current phase of the war. During a rescue operation for a downed F-15E crew back in early April, the commander of U.S. Central Command reportedly ordered B-2 bombers to fly a round-trip mission, specifically to drop MOPs on an underground Revolutionary Guard headquarters near Tehran, using time-sensitive intelligence about a large gathering of IRGC commanders inside that bunker. Sources described the facility as obliterated in that strike, and separately reported that Air Force B-1 bombers dropped roughly 100 additional 2,000-pound bombs during that same operation, aimed specifically at pushing Iranian ground forces away from the immediate rescue area while the underground strike and the personnel recovery both unfolded simultaneously. So yes, devastating bunker buster bombs have absolutely been used on Iran multiple times, across multiple different targets, at multiple points throughout this war. If that's all this video needed to confirm, we'd already be finished here. But here's why I don't think that's actually the most important version of this particular story right now. It's the part I promised you at the top. There's a site inside Iran that's become the single biggest open question hanging over this entire bunker buster conversation, and it's not one you've probably heard mentioned by name until very recently. It's called Pickaxe Mountain, known in Farsi as Ku-e-Kolangaz-la, and it sits buried inside Iran's Zagros mountain range, just a couple kilometers from the Natanz nuclear facility. Iran has reportedly been quietly excavating deep tunnels and large underground chambers inside this mountain since around 23 years before any of the current fighting started, and it's never been inspected by international nuclear monitors since construction began. Iran describes it publicly as a centrifuge assembly plant. Western governments and independent nuclear experts have raised serious concerns about its scale, its location, and its design, precisely because none of that description has ever been independently verified. The nickname itself is worth a quick mention too, because it tells you something about how seriously American military and intelligence circles have been tracking this specific site. Pickaxe Mountain is the informal designation the U.S. military itself has apparently given to Ku-e-Kolangaz-la, which loosely translates to something like the mountain of the gas pickaxe in Farsi. When American defense circles start assigning their own working nicknames to a foreign facility, rather than just referring to it by its official name, that's usually a sign the site has been on their radar as a serious planning concern for a meaningful stretch of time already, not something that just appeared on anyone's threat assessment overnight. Trump's actual quoted language from that same appearance is worth including in a bit more detail, because the phrasing itself is revealing about how confident the administration is projecting on this specific question. He said the U.S. sees no activity there right now, framed that as evidence Iran isn't doing well with its broader nuclear situation, and added that every time the U.S. hears about a site like this, it eventually gets hit, before stating plainly that Pickaxe would probably get, in his own words, a shot relatively soon. That's confident, dismissive language about Iran's current capability at the site, paired with a direct threat of future action, but notably, it stops short of claiming any strike has already happened, which lines up exactly with everything else independently verified about this story so far. There's also a detail from just this past week that I think is one of the more revealing signals in this entire story, if you actually know how to read it. Reports surfaced that the U.S. military has ordered an additional batch of these 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators on an accelerated emergency basis, something that hadn't happened since right after the original Fordo strikes back in 2025. On its own, that could read a couple of different ways. On one hand, it's reassuring in a sense. It means the military isn't scrambling because it's already run critically low on this specific weapon. This is a proactive restock rather than a sign of an active shortage mid-campaign. On the other hand, ordering more of your single most powerful conventional weapon on an emergency basis, outside the normal competitive procurement process, is not something that typically happens unless planners are seriously preparing for the possibility of needing to use several more of them relatively soon, and Pickaxe Mountain is the single most obvious candidate for exactly that kind of planning right now. It's also worth understanding just how unusual this specific procurement move actually is within the normal defense acquisition process. Major munitions purchases, especially for something as specialized and expensive as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, typically go through a standard competitive bidding process that can take months or even years to fully work through, involving multiple contractors, extensive testing requirements, and layered budgetary approval. Bypassing that standard process in favor of an emergency, accelerated order is something the Pentagon reserves specifically for situations where operational planners believe there's a real, near-term possibility they'll need that exact capability sooner than the normal procurement timeline would allow. That's a meaningfully different signal than routine inventory replenishment, and it's exactly the kind of detail that tends to get buried underneath flashier headlines, even though it might actually be one of the more concrete, verifiable indicators of what's being planned behind closed doors. If you want a genuinely useful comparison for why this specific mountain is considered a tougher problem than Fordo, here's the detail that stood out to me most. Fordo sits under a mountain that's roughly 400 meters high. The mountain covering Pickaxe, near Natanz, is reportedly around 650 meters, well over 50% taller. More overlying rock generally means more protection against any weapon trying to punch through from above, which is exactly why some analysts believe Pickaxe was deliberately positioned and designed specifically to be a harder problem than Fordo ever was, built with the lessons of that earlier strike already in mind. There's a connection worth drawing here to something else circulating in coverage of this broader conflict. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, believed to total somewhere around 900 pounds, most of it enriched to 60% purity. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency has publicly stated the agency believes roughly 200 kilograms of that material is stored in deep tunnels at a separate complex outside Isfahan, with additional quantities potentially at Natanz. Pickaxe Mountain sits just a couple kilometers from Natanz specifically, which has led some analysts to speculate, though this remains genuinely speculative rather than confirmed, that the deep tunnel network at Pickaxe could eventually serve as a secure, hardened storage or processing location for at least a portion of that existing stockpile, precisely because its extreme depth would make it an extraordinarily difficult target for exactly the kind of weapon capable of reaching most of Iran's other nuclear infrastructure. Nothing about that connection has been officially confirmed by any government or international body, but the geographic proximity and the emphasis on extreme depth are exactly the kind of details that make Pickaxe Mountain relevant to more than just its own standalone construction story. Now, if you're the kind of person who wants me to actually keep tracking this specific site as new satellite imagery and reporting comes out, drop a comment with the word pickaxe, and I'll make sure any real update on this specific site gets built into a dedicated follow-up video rather than getting buried inside some other broader roundup down the line. Because a story this technical genuinely deserves its own focused breakdown when the next real development actually lands. Let me walk you through the broader pattern of bunker buster use across this entire war. Because Pickaxe Mountain doesn't exist in isolation, it's really the culmination of a strategy that's been building for months. Back in March, GBU-57 bunker busters were used against Iranian anti-ship cruise missile sites, specifically positioned along the edge of the Strait of Hormuz, part of a broader effort to reopen that waterway to commercial shipping traffic. Those are shallower, more conventional hardened targets, missile storage bunkers and launch positions, not deeply buried nuclear infrastructure, which is exactly why a smaller 5,000-pound weapon was sufficient, rather than needing the full 30,000-pound MOP. Separately, 2,000-pound class bunker busters have been used against targets like a large ammunition depot near Isfahan. Again, a real, verified strike, but again a fundamentally different category of target than something buried under hundreds of feet of granite, specifically engineered to withstand exactly this kind of attack. That's actually the most useful way to think about this entire topic. Not as one single category of devastating bunker buster bomb, but as a genuine hierarchy of weapons matched to a hierarchy of targets, with Pickaxe Mountain sitting right at the very top of that hierarchy as the one target that might actually exceed what even the biggest weapon available can reliably guarantee to eliminate. It's worth walking through that hierarchy target by target because I think seeing it laid out makes the overall logic click into place. 2,000-pound class weapons like the GBU-31 have handled things like ammunition depots and fortified but largely surface-level or shallow structures. Targets where the goal is triggering secondary explosions and structural collapse rather than punching through hundreds of feet of solid rock. 5,000-pound weapons like the GBU-72 stepped in specifically for slightly more hardened coastal defense positions and missile sites, still shallow by comparison but requiring more raw penetrating force than the smaller weapon could reliably deliver. The 30,000-pound MOP was reserved specifically for the deepest, most hardened nuclear infrastructure the U.S. military has encountered anywhere in the world, Fort O-First, then reportedly an underground IRGC command bunker. And now Pickaxe Mountain sits at a level above even that top tier, a target so deep that some experts are openly questioning whether the top weapon in that entire hierarchy is actually sufficient on its own, without either additional coordinated strikes or some other method of verification, and follow up that current war conditions simply don't allow for right now, at least not without a dramatic and unlikely shift in how this entire conflict is currently being managed on the ground. Quick thing before we go deeper into this, because I think it's genuinely worth your time, follow now if you want the rest of this breakdown, because the numbers on how deep this thing is buried are honestly hard to believe. Here's where it gets genuinely wild. Multiple outlets, citing satellite imagery reviewed by outlets including the Washington Post, report that Pickaxe Mountain's underground chambers sit somewhere between 260 and 330 feet below the surface, and separately, other reporting citing regional sources describes the facility as buried up to 600 meters, which is nearly 2,000 feet, under solid granite. Those two figures don't fully agree with each other, which honestly tells you something important on its own. Nobody outside Iran's own government actually has a fully confirmed precise number here. And that uncertainty is a real part of the story rather than a detail I can just smooth over for you. There's a really telling detail buried inside that satellite reporting too. One that suggests Iran isn't just sitting still while this threat hangs over the site. Analysts reviewing recent imagery specifically noted new security walls constructed around the mountain's perimeter, reinforced tunnel entrances that appear meaningfully stronger than earlier construction phases, fresh excavation work still actively underway, and heavy construction equipment continuing to operate at the site as recently as the past few weeks. One fellow at a foreign policy research institute who reviewed that same imagery told Reuters that specifically strengthening those tunnel entrances would directly complicate targeting with penetrating munitions, like bunker busters, meaning Iran appears to understand exactly what kind of weapon it's trying to defend against, and is actively working to harden the single most vulnerable point of entry, the tunnel portals themselves, right now, in real time, even as the broader threat of a strike continues to grow week over week with no sign of either side backing down from their current position. What experts do broadly agree on is the comparison that actually matters most for understanding why this site is such a problem. Military analysts generally estimate America's most powerful conventional bunker busters can penetrate somewhere around 200 feet of earth and rock, or roughly 20 feet of reinforced concrete, before they run out of kinetic energy to keep boring downward. If Pickaxe Mountain's underground halls really do sit at the low end of that reported range, 260 to 330 feet down, that's already right at or beyond the outer edge of what even the biggest bomb in the American arsenal is generally believed capable of reliably reaching. And that's before you even factor in the higher 600-meter estimate some reporting has floated, which would put it dramatically further out of reach entirely. To put that in perspective, nuclear experts have specifically noted that Pickaxe Mountain appears to be buried even deeper than Fordo, the facility that was already considered one of the most fortified nuclear sites on the planet before this war even started, and the same facility that took 14 separate MOP strikes back in June of last year just to get through it. Iran's own parliamentary advisor described Pickaxe Mountain this week as, in his words, the most heavily fortified nuclear facility in the world. And while that's obviously a claim coming from a source with every incentive to talk up the site's defenses, independent nuclear analysts reviewing the same satellite data have landed on genuinely similar conclusions about just how difficult a target this actually is, even without sharing that same political motivation for emphasizing the site's strength. It's worth noting the two sides of this comparison actually agree on more than you'd initially expect, which is itself a fairly rare occurrence in coverage of a war this contested. Iranian officials have every reason to talk up Pickaxe Mountain's defenses publicly, both as a genuine deterrent and as a domestic morale message. American and independent Western analysts, by contrast, have no obvious incentive to exaggerate how hard a target is. If anything, the political and military pressure generally runs the opposite direction, toward projecting confidence that any target can eventually be reached given enough resources and time. When both sides, despite having opposite incentives, are landing on broadly similar assessments about the sheer physical difficulty of this specific site, that convergence is worth taking seriously as a genuine signal rather than dismissing either side as simply exaggerating for effect. It's worth remembering exactly what happened at Fordo to understand why this comparison carries so much weight. David Albright, president of the Institute for Science and International Security, and one of the most frequently cited independent nuclear analysts covering this entire conflict, had actually flagged Fordo's extreme depth as a serious targeting problem years before this war ever started, writing in a 2022 report that the facility was already viewed as buried so extremely deeply it would be difficult to destroy in an air attack at all. That assessment turned out to be at least partially validated by what actually happened. It took 14 separate MOP impacts. Not one, not two, but 14, concentrated specifically on ventilation shafts rather than randomly spread across the site, just to achieve what officials described as sufficient damage. And even now, more than a year later, the full extent of that damage still hasn't been independently confirmed by international inspectors, because Iran hasn't granted the access needed to verify it firsthand. If a site experts had been worried about for years, and that ultimately took 14 coordinated strikes to seriously damage, is now being described by multiple analysts as shallower than Pickaxe Mountain, that comparison alone should tell you everything you need to know about the scale of the problem this newer site actually represents. I want to pull in a specific expert assessment here, because I think it captures the nuance better than I can summarize on my own. One nuclear security researcher who reviewed the recent satellite imagery in detail put it about as precisely as this can be stated, saying the United States can almost certainly crater the entrances, collapse access tunnels, and cut off power and ventilation at Pickaxe Mountain from the air. But actually guaranteeing the destruction of everything underground, specifically those deep halls sitting 80 to 100 meters down, is a completely different problem. One that, in that expert's own words, is hard to achieve without either nuclear weapons or a physical, on-the-ground inspection afterward, neither of which is currently on the table. That's a genuinely important distinction, damaging the site's ability to function versus actually eliminating whatever is stored deep inside it. And it's exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened into a single triumphant headline the moment any strike actually happens there. So, has anyone actually struck it yet? As of everything I could verify, no. President Trump addressed Pickaxe Mountain directly in remarks on July the 13th, saying the U.S. is watching the site closely, that current activity there appears limited, and that Iran should expect the site to eventually get hit, in his words, relatively soon. That's a threat, stated publicly and directly, but it's not a confirmed executed strike. Separately, independent analysis from the Institute for Science and International Security assessed that the facility does not appear to be operational yet, though construction activity is continuing, and that it remains genuinely unclear what Iran ultimately intends to install there, especially given how much of the country's centrifuge manufacturing capacity was already degraded in earlier strikes on other sites. Let me give you my honest operational read on what a strike against Pickaxe Mountain would actually look like. If it does happen, based on how these systems function, you wouldn't expect a single pass. Based on the Fordo precedent, where it took 14 separate MOP impacts concentrated on specific ventilation and access points just to achieve what officials described as sufficient damage, any strike against an even deeper target like Pickaxe would very likely require multiple B-2 sorties, careful sequencing to let earlier impacts weaken the rock before follow-up, bombs punch deeper along the same channel, and extremely precise targeting of ventilation shafts and access tunnels rather than trying to just brute force through solid granite from a random point on the surface. That's a fundamentally more complex mission profile than a single strike package hitting a shallower target, and it's part of why officials interviewed on this story have consistently used careful, hedged language. Crater the entrances, sever the power, disrupt the ventilation, rather than confidently promising total destruction of whatever sits in those deepest chambers. There's an additional layer of operational risk worth mentioning here too, one that's specific to this particular target rather than bunker busting in general. Every one of these missions requires B-2 bombers to fly extraordinarily long round-trip routes. The strike on the IRGC headquarters near Tehran earlier this year reportedly involved aircraft, flying all the way from Whiteman Air Force Base in the continental United States and back. A genuinely grueling mission profile for aircrew, even before you factor in the complexity of actually finding and hitting a target this deeply buried. Multiple coordinated sorties against a single target like Pickaxe Mountain would multiply that operational burden significantly. More flight hours, more aerial refueling requirements, more exposure time in potentially contested airspace, and more opportunities for something in that long, complex chain to go wrong. That's part of why officials and analysts covering this story keep emphasizing just how significant an undertaking a full-scale strike against this specific site would actually represent, not because the individual weapon itself is new or untested, but because the sheer scale of coordinated effort required to reliably reach a target buried this deep pushes well past what a single routine strike mission typically involves. I also think it's worth being honest about what a strike like this could and couldn't prove, even if it does happen. Iran has not allowed international inspectors access to this site since construction began, which means there's no independently verified baseline of exactly what's stored there right now, and there wouldn't be a reliable way to independently verify what's left afterward either, unless Iran voluntarily allowed inspection access following any strike, which seems genuinely unlikely given the broader pattern of restricted access we've already seen throughout this entire conflict. So even a technically successful strike, one that collapses every visible entrance and severs every detectable utility line, might still leave a real, unresolved question about what actually survived deep inside those chambers. The exact same unresolved question currently hanging over Iran's separately stored enriched uranium stockpile at other facilities. Let me leave you with the accurate, complete version of this story, rather than the flattened headline version. Yes, the U.S. has repeatedly used real bunker buster bombs against real targets in Iran throughout this war, from the original Fordo and Natanz strikes last year, to an underground IRGC headquarters near Tehran this spring, to anti-ship missile positions and ammunition depots more recently. Those strikes happened, they're verified, and in several cases officials have described the specific targeted facilities as destroyed or obliterated. But the single most consequential bunker buster question in this entire conflict remains unresolved. Pickaxe Mountain, a nuclear-linked facility buried deeper than Fordo ever was, possibly beyond the reliable reach of even America's most powerful conventional weapon, has been threatened directly and repeatedly by the president himself, but as of right now has not actually been struck. Let me add one more layer of nuance to that summary because I think it's genuinely the most important single thing to walk away with from this entire breakdown. The word devastating in a headline, like the one on this video, isn't necessarily wrong about the past. Real bunker buster strikes on Iran genuinely have been devastating to the specific targets they hit: Fordo's centrifuge halls, an IRGC command bunker, missile positions along the strait. But applying that same word forward, implying it already describes what's happened or will inevitably happen at Pickaxe Mountain specifically, gets ahead of what the actual current engineering assessments and available intelligence currently support based on everything that's been independently verified so far. This is a rare case in modern warfare where the defender may have genuinely out-engineered the attacker's best available weapon, at least based on everything credibly reported so far. And that's a far more interesting, far more uncertain story than a headline promising a clean, decisive, already accomplished strike. If this kind of breakdown helped you understand something that a shorter, more dramatic headline flattened past, share it with someone who's been following this war but might not know Pickaxe Mountain even exists yet, because I genuinely think it's about to become one of the most talked about names in this entire conflict. And it's worth understanding the real technical stakes before that headline actually lands. Whatever happens to that mountain, whether it gets struck in the coming weeks the way Trump has promised, whether it turns out to genuinely be beyond what even a MOP can reliably destroy, or whether diplomacy somehow makes the entire question moot before it's ever tested, I'll be tracking it closely and breaking down exactly what the verified reporting actually supports, not the more dramatic version that gets clicks. Thanks so much for sticking with something this technical, and I'll see you in the next breakdown. One final thought before I let you go, because I think it actually ties this entire story back together. Every single bunker buster strike we talked about today, Fordo, the IRGC headquarters, the anti-ship sites along the strait, was, at the time it happened, the biggest, most decisive story in this war for exactly one news cycle. Pickaxe Mountain is very likely going to be next in that same pattern, a dramatic headline, a wave of triumphant coverage, and then, weeks later, exactly the same quieter, more complicated questions we've been asking about every other target so far. How deep did it actually reach? What actually survived? And how would anyone even independently confirm the answer either way without access nobody's currently offering? Understanding that pattern now, before the headline actually lands, is honestly the most useful thing I can leave you with, because it means you'll already know exactly which questions to ask the moment the story breaks for real, instead of just accepting whatever the very first triumphant headline claims.